Good morning. I would like to thank you for taking the time to join us in this session. Thanks to Aapresid for giving us this space to report on what Bayer is doing. I will be the moderator. I'll make a brief introduction, then Federico Vartorelli will take the floor. He works at the global team of Bayer Improvement. He's an agronomist of the University of Nebraska. He works with corn crops and other crops such as soybean. Fede, in the past few years, has worked in Asia and Africa with particular crops. Now, talking about corn, what we have seen in the past 6 months, what has called our attention, some of the highlights. To set the framework, corn crops are key to Argentina, not just on economic terms, but it's a contribution on rotation. Economically, corn is the third agri-sector in gross value after soybean and bovine meat. We produce 50 million of tons a year. 30% is processed in Argentina for high biologic content proteins. It goes for swine production, bovine production, and poultry. In the past 20 years, in 2004-05, corn increased fourfold to up to 8 million hectares of production. It's an amazing crop production in Argentina, but the growth of this crop has been amazing. It's fantastic in sustainable production in Argentina. Corn with soy in rotation is great, but we always want to go a bit further. And we speak of the yield gaps when we talk of that. And if we check out yields, what we have and what we could have, just by organizing and making better use of technology currently available, we could be growing 36%. We could reach up to 11,000 tons of corn if we follow these numbers. It's a 36% more that we could be having. We choose 3 or 4 management measures. Knowing better the production environment, you cover 40 to 70% of that gap. With the digital tools currently available, we can better understand the environment and position the germplasm much better. Optimized depending on the production environment. With that, we could get a 20 to 22% more of that yield gap. And then nutritional content, nitrogen and sanitary and management and weed and bug control. When we talk about the yield gap, it's not just a gap, but that gap exposes us to a greater production risk. You are producing at the lower yield level, so it exposes your crop to any risk that can come up during the campaign. Last year, we saw it in some regions. In some regions due to spiroplasm. In other regions, it was a combination of weather and spiroplasm. So when you're at the bottom level of corn production, you're exposing yourself to high risk. So Federico will describe what is the yield of corn in Argentina compared to other countries, where we stand, and how this effect of underinvestment in the crop has an impact on final yield, and how any issue like the ones arising on the last campaign can have a great impact on us. So Fede, you can take the floor, share your presentation, and we'll save a 10-minute slot for a Q&A at the end. You can scan the QR code to post your questions. Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming over and showing interest in the talk and the crop. It is a great pleasure for me. Work gives me the opportunity to visit many production systems worldwide, and I always say the same. Argentine technicians are world champions of resilience. Agriculture managing external factors. And that's what we'll discuss today, how together companies, technicians, and producers work on that. I'll start with a reflection on corn crops. It's important to understand it. Look at two references. The U.S., the greatest world producer, greater yield average as country, and they have data for much longer than us. If you check out the evolution of corn crop performance from the end of the 70s, when gene improvement starts, gene enhancement, we always make the same joke. We don't know based on what the first 70 years why you paid the enhancer, because there was no gene enhancement. The average yield in the country did not improve, but from then on, you see how all technology applied by producers and available improve the country average yield. The Argentine situation is worth a positive remark. It increased fivefold its production. The evolution is very important throughout these years. The first reflection on this, do you think that was achieved by applying technology in agricultural practices or by environmental changes? And I believe it's a combination of all that allowed that progress in yield. To the right, the top 10 corn producers, and I had the chance to visit production plots in all of them. There's a third reflection we might make. If you look at the country average of those countries and put it on the timeline, compare it to the US timeline, which is the longest one, you will see that if you go to the Tanzania with the lowest yield average, but it's the top 10, it's within the top 10 producers, you find a yield which is similar to the pre-hybrid age of the US, and you find that in that country they have a pre-hybrid agricultural stage. So don't go to a museum, just walk around the world and you will see the past 100 years of history of corn production, depending on where you are in the world. So it's important to reflect on this and understand that the crop production is favorable, the application of technology and agricultural practices by producers has certainly improved the performance of the crop. Now, this is work we regularly do in research and development in Bayer. Developing gene material takes up to 8 years to have volume in the producer's hand. It's not worth it to react to what happened last campaign. We need to understand where the crop and the external factors are heading to, and production factors. What's the trend? Why does a producer change his or her practices? Why is there no till or a wider move in Argentina, the use of chemicals, the use of biotechnology? All these factors affect the genetics, affect why we do genetic. For a year and a half, with some universities, we started developing a model to understand current signals to describe future scenarios. Once you understand what are the forces that affect the crop and its practices, you identify the key forces involved. As you walk the world, you see how a producer from Romania is affected by water access and climate change differently. For them, that is fundamental. It modifies their crop production system. In India, too, we had a day and a half of work with Aapresid, CREA, with some universities, with people from INTA. We brought together producers, trying to understand, out of all these factors, what is the main driver of changes in the production system of Argentina. But if we see the main ones, no surprise, macroeconomic and tax forces, withholdings, for example, that is the main modification driver force of change in the crop system. And you shall see later, too, that and we are all embedded in an economic activity, but the true external factor promoting production system in economic terms and with the return on investment is key. You move the crop from more to marginal use of technology available. And we've always known this. We limit the yield. Looking at the curves, the difference from one country to the next, it's a 4 or 3-fold difference. Another reason that we understand much better now, we increase susceptibility of the crop to external factors. So it's not just the yield potential, but it's the interannual variability of the yield potential that's affected by the level of technology used, which is not the maximum one available. And this happened to us with a new condition. For many, it's new, but for others, it's been a struggle for years. The LATAM research team has been working on it for 11 years, 6 in Brazil. From 2011 to 2017, I lived there. In 2015, the first impact of spiroplasm and of the corn stunt disease became a challenge. It was a problem that until then had not been a real issue. That's the reality, and we must understand that, as in all disease, we must work in knowing the condition, learning about the environment, how the environment mitigates the effect of the disease, and us. We should develop disease-resistant material. Let's consider the disease we're talking about. I'm sure you have read and heard a lot and experienced and unfortunately suffered on your own this stunt disease. The corn stunt disease in the southern hemisphere arose in 2015. I'll start with the end of the movie. But indeed, in 2015, we had two diseases arising. The research team associated to climate change and environmental effects, both of them originate in Mexico, and both of them travel differently. The tarch spot in Iowa and Illinois generated and is still a problem. We believe it's the hurricanes that introduced the disease in 2015, and the other one is like spiroplasm, suffered in Brazil in 2015 harshly. But the disease was first described in the south of the U.S., but sourced and originated in Mexico. In 1940 already, the paper from the U.S. says it could cause late crop damage. In Brazil, there were different outbreaks. In 82 and 83, if you were producing back then, it was a year after the plague of Rio Cuarto, as we know it. This is a disease, but it has to be treated as a pest because it is associated to a vector. So, spiroplasm appears in Brazil, and in Rio Cuarto we have another pest too. But there were successive outbreaks. In 2015, it was the most striking one, the one that forced reaction from the industry, mainly in Brazil. What are the factors that correlate with the condition? We see two. All the models and work we've been doing point out at two things. The distance to the focus of disease, the 500 kilometers you see on the chart with disease prevalence. In the zone up to a large area, the disease has an opportunity to arise. And the other factor is the maximum and minimum temperatures. As you see on the charts, the years are expressed in crop years. We're talking about past campaigns. You see in Argentina, the chart in the middle, and I'm sorry if you cannot read it from the back, you see the minimum temperature was much higher in the past campaign compared to previous ones. So the minimum temperature, the disease prevalence coming from the south of Brazil, it is seen. The simulation models indicate that in 2014, from the subtropical temperate region in Argentina, we had the conditions given for the disease to arise. That is going back a bit, but in previous years, there was a clear distinction between temperatures between the north and the south. We have the situation in Brazil, same two factors, temperature, disease prevalence, and we see how the disease appeared with focused areas of outbreaks. The prevalence of the disease and the temperatures match and make last year, for example, a very unique year. How are we working on this? How is this evolving now? There's lab work, field work, and the big difference here compared to the work we did with the Rio Cuarto pest, where we did not have any genomic tools to apply, there was no predictive tools or simulation means. So you see, currently we have better tools to work on this challenge. So point one, yes, We continue to study and monitor the condition and understanding the vector too, but we also do important work on simulation to understand disease dynamics and the probability of occurrence. We also work on understanding genomic selection. Point 2, how we select with a focus on the disease, now more than before. That is an important aspect. The rest imply understanding the disease, understanding how the solution comes hand in hand with genetics and in agricultural practices and the use of chemicals. We see how the intensive use of pesticides increases, and in our research trials we test alternatives to the use of chemicals. This is the broad spectrum of work. Just to show you a chart, the selection that we did in some regions this year. In green, you have the yield yielding more than the average, and it is disease resistant, or the level of damage caused by the disease is below the median. In red, we drop that. It is part of the selection mechanism. But we see material that is clearly more disease resistant than other. And that's your work as producers and technicians to understand in our region, in the area where you are working, what is the material that better adapts to that environment and shows better disease resistance profiles. And to conclude and have room for Q&A, I believe it's important that we understand 4 things we must do. 2 we are responsible of, and for the other 2 we ask your full cooperation. It is our responsibility to maintain the focus on science to better understand the disease. That's essential for any disease we work on. Second, maintain the focus on science to develop genetic material that is disease resistant. That's the path we have followed with this and with any other disease arising.
Uno con el foco en las prácticas agrícolas.
Then agricultural practices, understanding seeding time, spontaneous crops, that's important. The green bridges are important to reduce.
El uso de químicos, todo lo que tiene que ver con el manejo agrícola, maíz, y también.
And of course, as I was saying in the beginning, the importance of applying available technology. We have experienced this. If we move away from corn and we go to any other epidemic, we had a human epidemic a few years ago. So the question is, who do you think was more susceptible to the disease? People that were weaker, they were more affected, or people that were stronger? Of course, there was a genetic component having a role. But as it happens with every epidemic, any crop, a better corn is much more prepared for an adverse condition such as this one, drought, or any external factor than a corn that is suffering due to the marginal use of technology. So that is something to consider, how we can understand that increasing technology in the harvesting of corn is not only about exploring the yields potential, but also decreasing this interannual variability and increase the resilience of the crop. So that is the message, and we have time for questions if you wish. Thank you very much. I don't have any question in my phone, but perhaps the system failed. If you have any question, I can give you the mic in the traditional method. Good morning. This disease, the farming sector, for us it comes as a surprise, especially in template in the Mesopotamia, Uruguay, Argentina, your core area. And of course there is an important work going on from the genetic improvement side. This reality, these pathogens transmitted by the leafhopper, we have 4 pathogens, and they have been found and identified in sick corn in the area of Entre Rios and Uruguay, basically Uruguay, the 2 bacteria and the 2 viruses. So my question is, from the point of view of what we can expect from genetic improvement and advancements, not only in understanding the disease but also the solutions, what can you tell us concerning the difficulties of having to deal with 4 pathogens that are different? Thank you very much for your question. In reality, even though these are 4 different pathogens, the assessment of the disease is towards the Spiroplasma complex. So if you see the diversity of genetic material going on, and if you see how in Brazil, for instance, we were able to mitigate the disease, is because we developed and increased the participation in the market of the most resistant elements to the disease. So it's not different, even though it's 4 different pathogens in one complex, it is not different from the work that happens with any other condition. Clearly, there is resistance. The most tropical materials are more resistant to the disease. And something that is quite interesting that happened in the world, and that is part of what is seen or what leads to these interannual differences, is that what happens in the world of corn and other crops as well is that tropical regions are tempering their weather with more intervention of template material because they have historical background of genetic improvement cycles for better yield. So that gives rise to a presence of genetic material that is more susceptible in regions where you have a higher probability of the disease. The genetic work is not different from other diseases as well. And one would say Brazil had a slightly better year concerning this disease, even though they had the conditions given for a more serious disease than what happened even in Argentina, and also because of the launch of resistant material in Brazil. 2 questions. The first one, we didn't have an improvement, we don't have a recipe, we are without solutions. So, first, we do have improvement. Fede mentioned during his presentation that from Bayer we are improving, focusing on the disease. We do have in place a subtropical hybrid improvement program in the NEA and the NOAA, which is the endemic region of the disease. So we have been working already for over 10 years focusing on this disease. And secondly, the producer in the NEA and the NOAA started to include tempered hybrid in our template portfolio to test them in the north area of the country. And there we have been recommending template hybrids with good behavior of this disease. So we are improving, we are working, focusing on these regions, focusing on this disease, because we are well aware that in these regions the disease comes up every year. So we do have that solutions package with hybrids that are tolerant, quite tolerant to the disease. And then for insecticides, foliar insecticides and seed treatment, as you know, SENASA enabled a record of products. We have been registered, or we have registered ourselves in that record, and we do seed treatments, a foliar product that will enable us to accompany the tolerant germplasm. So clearly we are compensating, we are thinking about this not only for a year but many years, and we can have a full suggestion or recommendation for any producer that needs to plant corn. Two additional comments to what you have just touched on. Genomic improvement for the disease for over 9 years, assessment of the disease 4 years ago. If you haven't had your work on the disease, then if you revert the situation and you take another disease such as the Rio Cuarto disease, is 100% susceptible to the disease, has never been exposed to the disease. When we see today the material in our market in Argentina, you see variability of susceptibility to the disease with certain materials that are moderately and highly resistant to the disease. So that is the achievement of the work carried out of having placed a focus on this, that from now on the disease is a bigger threat and more important threat. Well, indeed, that is the case. However, I think it's important to understand that if we didn't work on this disease in the past, then the damage or the impact would have been much more serious. The next question says, how do you compare the yield gap with the United States, because they have concentrated corn in good areas and we have corn in many, many environments or areas? Fede, when we speak about gap, or what I said about the gap of this 36% is with data of Argentina. We cannot compare with the United States, but Fede did show the comparison chart with the United States and the rest of producers of corn. Yeah, in the United States, it's more or less the same. I have been living there 6 years between Nebraska and Missouri, and if you walk around the Corn Belt, the American Corn Belt, as you move towards Kansas, it is a poor area. You have seen that in the yield. And if you go to the south of that belt, Corn Belt, you see differences. They have concentrations in an area where the soils are similar to our best soils, but that doesn't mean that those are the conditions that are present. What they do have is a high level of technology application, level of fertilizers which are higher. This is a subsidized agriculture that awards and maximizes production per hectare. Therefore, that is the only concern, and it is interesting to see this exercise about which is the concern of the producer, which is economy, microeconomy, macroeconomy, withholdings. When you do the same exercise in other levels of the world, such as the United States, then you have regulations, climate change, and the impact they are suffering in this sense, especially with regulations for regenerative agriculture and innovation, of course, is an element as well. Withholding, macroeconomy, microeconomy, taxes do not have an impact. Especially even these areas these years in the past when there was an increase in the price of fertilizers. So here there is another question. Fede, you showed the maps where there is a level of occurrence at national level. What do these models say about the next campaign? And another question, the team is working with modeling the disease from today to 20 years times, but it depends on the preciseness of the climatic model prediction. Because this is a disease that is highly associated to temperatures, maximum, minimum temperatures. If this prediction model works, not only is good for this, but also to predict the next 20 campaigns in general terms, because this is climatic prediction. But nowadays we cannot tell you much. We can tell you about the importance of monitoring, of carrying out these practices that mitigate the occurrence probability, and monitor everything that has to do with temperatures and the prevalence of the disease that we know that is there. The second question is for the seeds of this campaign are going to be treated with high doses of pesticides. No, they are not going to have to be treated with high doses of insecticide. There is a higher level of doses for seed treatment to recommend and treat seeds. We are assessing for each of the types what is the best type of response or how this seed treatment works with higher doses. We need to have several testings that will not only imply to understand how high doses of insecticide can affect the material, but also understanding how later on the treated seeds we can store them in our plant and then sell them in the future. So there are many things that we need to fully understand before we can treat a seed with a higher level of insecticide. The same goes for treatments to the fields, to the farm. We have two treatments approved by SENASA, but we need to have our own assessment to have a certain evaluation for our customers. And one more question. The farming date was not important in agriculture area direct. What would be the change? I understand. I'm not sure about this question. Perhaps you can clarify if you're here. But what I understand from this question, if the planting date was not important, was not more important in the NEA, NOAA areas of Santa Fe, and how does this have an impact in decreasing the effect of the disease? In terms of dates, as we have said before, this harvest, this planting date that is scalonated is like a green bridge that in South America, on the south area of South America, we have corn the entire year. And that clearly has an impact. In terms of nutrition is what we said about the technological package. A well-planted product with a high value of genetics and a technological package that is strong, a use of chemicals, it is much more or less acceptable to diseases such as this one than marginally made crop. Have you been working in the knowledge and biology of the vector? We have hypotheses to understand what is the mechanism that is in operation so that it can happen in a germplasm and not in another one. Indeed, and that is one of the 4 graphs that I mentioned before that has to do with efficiency of the disease, actually. In general terms, we do have a view or a perspective for research that is quite pragmatic. We were aiming at resistance more than understanding the physiognomy of resistance, but it ends up being a derivative of the work for resistance to understand at the end of the day the physiology, but we are not especially for the genetic improvement. What we are aiming at is, as I showed before, highly yield productive elements and with more resistance. If seeds that the producer has stored or in stock can be treated with insecticides, the answer is yes, they can be treated, but you need to verify with the seeder if they have a warranty program and if the warranty program is still valid for reseeding. If you retreat the seeds, that loses the reseeding insurance. If low temperatures of July, do they affect the vector? Is there any higher mortality rates in place? I understand that there are data that temperatures under 2 degrees do affect or would lead to the death of the vector. There is a trickery law that was applied this year, trying to understand how it works, that they didn't, if leafhoppers showed up in the monitoring networks, that doesn't mean that they are not there. So we need to be cautious and also have a monitor. We need to supervise what comes up from that network, especially at seeding moment. But temperatures under 0 degrees probably or indeed affected the dynamic of the leafhoppers. What is the incidence of the impact of the disease? In diminishing the impact of the disease, the use of pesticides, and what is your recommendation knowing that the leafhopper is already present in the lots compared to campaigns of other years? And any management measure that improve the crops is going to help us prepare better for this disease and have a better yield, of course. What are the recommendations you will have in consideration with the presence of the leafhopper in the lots? Well, as I said, to have a follow-up of all these networks, understanding the dynamics of the leafhopper, understanding which are the areas where we have a higher population of leafhoppers that are infectious or that are carrying the disease. Then, of course, we need to start applying all the management control measures, monitoring, use of tolerant germplasm, application of insecticides, and the entire technological package of all the companies we are recommending to manage this disease. But after what happened with the last campaign, we need to pay extra attention and to do a follow-up and to have all the technological packages ready to apply them when necessary. Next question. Why do you think that spiroplasm exploited, especially in the north of the country, has been found in Buenos Aires as well? Well, what Fede mentioned, conditions, environmental conditions during the last campaign were enablers for this disease. I remember, as it is today, some of the WhatsApp messages in May last year with presence of leafhoppers in Las Rosas region, etc. As Fede said, the highest minimum temperatures of last year favored the existence or the survival of infected leafhoppers during the entire winter. Also, the exit of La Niña was not the same in all the regions, so that we had seeding or planting of corn the entire year, so they were able to move around from one place to the other. So in endemic areas, the Córdoba, Center of Santa Fe, Entre Rios, the impact was quite quite serious in the rest of the regions, even though we had some outbreaks, but the level of incidence was low. Yield loss were more related to the climate or hydric deficiencies during the crop cycle.
One question over here. In Venado Tuerto for corn seed and commercial corn, because of the leafhopper, we believe that we might not delay. If we were too early, could it be a slow start and that may cause more chances of infection? Because if you seed in October, everything grows faster. In September, it all goes slowly. Again, as Fede explained, any situation that puts the crop under stress would favor the disease growth. Having said that, the vector needs to be present. An infected vector should be present. So that's a terrain I'm not too familiar with, but the early concentrated seeding is better than late seeding when you have more presence of infected leafhoppers. We don't have work with evidence showing that exposure of the crop in the earlier stages for longer are associated to greater disease damage. There's no study on that. There was a similar one for September crops in Entre Rios, right? Entre Rios will start seeding soon, very early. They should follow adequate recommendations. I'm not sure if out of date range. -28 I see here. But I want to make a comment in reference to the previous question, because in this phase we are learning many things that are unknown. Of what we know of the vector is that the female infected can live longer without eating, and it endures -20 degrees without dying, and it flies further, greater distances. So we need the yellow traps, the active traps with nets, but so as not to go nuts, because seeding earlier, I mean, it has a limit, and the limit is the freezing. Don't do it too early, and then you are just adding one problem on top of the other. But it is common sense. If you start seeding earlier, you feed corn into the mouth of the leafhopper, and because it takes longer and it can live longer, up to 90 days. So I think that responds with knowledge, and don't go crazy on earlier, because too early you have the risk of the freeze. I don't have any questions on my phone, but if you have questions, I'll pass the mic. Yes, we're kicked out. Thank you so much for your